about fostering new contributors using lessons that we've learned from the SWT project. So it's not really an in-depth technical discussion today, it's mostly talking about community management and topics relating to that. But there will be some technical examples relating to this sort of stuff. And we can get the formalities out of the way. I'm Eric Williams, I work at Red Hat on SWT, specifically the Linux side of things, so GTK. And I used to be an intern about 3 years ago during my university time, and for the last year and a half I've been working full-time at Red Hat on SWT, just like I was during my internship. And I will introduce my colleague.
I'm Alexander Kurtakov. I had the luck or bad luck, as it depends on you how you call it, to start working on SWT when there was the generation change and all the previous guys were stepping away. So had the chance to face many of the issues that are now hopefully gone, and what we did to improve the community is quite important for me, as it's the closest project to my heart, let's say it that way. The rest involved in many other projects, but that's not for this talk.
Hold on. And now the slides don't want to go. There we go. Okay. So before we get into the details about SWT, lessons from community management, we should probably talk about what community management even is. Basically, the long and short of it is that the community in an open source software project is basically how the code ends up being merged. So most people usually they only think of the actual content, which is the code. And in big companies, this is kind of very linear because there is no community. Everyone is working at the same place, and it's basically like an office environment. Open source is not like that. You have people coming from all kinds of different places, either in their own free time, working for other companies, stuff like that. So community management in open source really means getting the logistics, dealing with the logistics of getting code merged. And also attracting new contributors, because there's not always a steady stream of people working on your project.
In short, what people call project management, when in open source it's community management, as you only get the community for your project. The code is nothing without the community. If you don't have people helping you to maintain and continue developing it, your project is more or less not existing.
So community management, or project management, if you'd like to use that term, has a bunch of different aspects to it. Basically, there is marketing. You have to advertise your project so that people are willing to work on it. You have to keep it up to date in terms of documentation. You have to manage things like community interaction. So not everyone is working from the same place. So a lot of discussion takes place in the community, so on issue trackers and mailing lists and so on. And then there are also technical decisions, like how to design things so that people will continue to contribute to your project, so that it doesn't just stagnate and slowly die off. And then you also have to identify things that would prohibit people from contributing code. So this is a big one, especially if you have people who are working in their free time. They are not going to want to run gauntlets or deal with big obstructions to merge their code if it's costing them their own personal time, right? Everyone has a limit, and you don't want to push that boundary. So why is this important? We already spoke about this a little bit earlier, but as Alex mentioned, it basically boils down to new contributors. So if you only have the same 5 people contributing to a project, eventually people will move on or life circumstances will change. And if you don't have a steady stream of new people coming into your project, then your project will slowly die off and it will just become dead, which is obviously something that nobody wants. So here's a visual conception, kind of. For those of you who are more visually oriented, I suppose. And this is a nice stock photo of a truck. Basically, you have a contributor who shows up, he's got some sort of patch or some sort of interest in your project and wants to have his or her patch merged. And the road that you're driving on is the path that you have to take to reach your goal, so to merge your patch. And the metaphor here, of course, is no one's going to want to drive on your project's road if it's filled with all kinds of roadblocks. So if you're driving along and there's a landslide, chances are you're not going to want to get around that just to merge your patch. You're going to say, forget it, I'll do something else. So the goals of community management are basically to create a welcoming project so that people who are wanting to contribute can do so easily and without much hassle. And that way you have a revolving door of diverse number of contributors who have different approaches, and your project will stay alive. So how does this apply to SWT, and why is SWT involved in this? We'll get to the history kind of.
Just a few more words. So at certain point, SWT was more or less considered dead project. We had 2 or 3 people that were spending time as much as keeping the project releasing. And well, this was not visible initially. It became an issue when you update your operating system and oops, something is no longer working or it's no longer reliable and such stuff. And in SWT, we managed to get to a state from very popular, probably the most popular UI toolkit for Java in Java land, to a completely denied for new projects state. And now we more or less managed to get to a state where it's considered again as a viable option for new projects. It was an interesting path to go to the deepest down and try to climb back, as when once the word gets out that something's wrong with your project, it's way harder to fight that back than if you start a new project.
Okay, so now we'll deal with some of the examples from SWT, and the first one is obviously biggest one, I think, bugzilla, which is in SWT's case basically the front line. That's where you deal with the most number of new users. Some projects it's mailing lists, so for old school projects where most of the discussion happens over a mailing list, that would be your kind of front line. In SWT's case it's bugzilla. So one of the things that we learned, or that's a good practice in general, is when you have new bugs, don't let them sit for a long time. So if you have someone who is taking the time to report a bug that they've encountered, chances are they are at least amenable to contributing, or they can help you debug the issue further. Especially in open source, where there's no paid support, the people who are coming to you to report issues are likely your best friends in these scenarios. So the lesson we learned was respond to tickets early and get information from the user, and that way they feel like their needs are being met, and we also get the benefit of figuring out what people are using our software for in the real world and how to deal with these sorts of issues.
Yes, something more on that page is the amount of time you take to reply is the delay to the reply is critical for how your users will feel. If someone followed the OpenOffice to LibreOffice fork, and how LibreOffice became so much popular than OpenOffice in so short time, one of the reasons was because the LibreOffice Foundation, the Document Foundation, they hired a person to foster the newcomers and help them report proper bugs, supply their Gary changes and so on. There is a nice talk if anyone is interested 2 years ago at FOSDEM by LibreOffice guy who was hired for that position, and this is part of the reason why they managed to generate a very active project, probably one of the most active now, from a dead code base OpenOffice was. And this is something we try to achieve with SWT, although without the resources they have.
It's basically me who does that role. At least for the Linux side of things. There are other committers who do it for the other platforms. So in terms of the actual content from bugs, especially when it comes to lower level stuff in the stack, there are a lot of variables like operating system, what libraries they have installed, environment variables, custom configuration, stuff like that. So the goal is basically to get that information from the user as soon as possible, because you can waste a lot of time going back and forth, and then it turns out that there is some detail that neither one new, and then you've wasted all that time going back and forth when it could have been like a quick fix. So these sorts of things are critical, and it saves time on both sides. So it saves users time and it saves you time. And then we have the category which was difficult in SWT for a long time, which is managing existing bugs. And I'll get to the historical kind of context in the next slide, but basically you can't manage existing bugs if you don't have any idea of what your bugs are like. So if you have a huge ticket backlog, if you're a developer and you're trying to figure out where to focus your work, you're going to have a really hard time figuring out what to work on if you have like 2,000 issues open. So one of the key things is following up with people, making sure bugs are still relevant, closing old bugs, and keeping a clean bugzilla, because otherwise it just becomes completely unmanageable. So to give you some statistics, in 2015 when I started working, we had 2,500 Linux bugs on SWT, and these were of pretty wide variety. I remember closing some tickets from Windows 98 and Windows XP era type of bugs, which are obviously not reproducible anymore. Some things were even filed against GTK1 and early versions of GTK2, which have been deprecated for over a decade. And like I said before, if you have all these old tickets, you have really no idea what the state of your project is. So we made a concerted effort to close as many of these as possible. And I have some graphs as well. So this is from 2015 in half-year increments. I don't know if you can see the legend at the bottom, but it's basically 6-month chunks starting from January 1st, 2015 until now. And these are the number of bugs that we closed as either not reproducible anymore or they're duplicates of some other existing ticket or something like that. So these aren't fixes, these are just purely triaged issues that we already have somewhere else. So in total, we closed almost 1,400 of these in the last 3 years. The biggest year being 2016. There's over 450 tickets triaged, which that was quite a bit of work. That was like 50 bugs closed a day for 2 weeks. And that was like a full-time job for me, which can get pretty tedious after a while. And then just as a quick comparison, here's also a graph of the bugs that were fixed in Linux. So things where there is an actual commit or a patch submitted that fixed a bug. So the numbers are smaller. It caps out at just over 200 in 2016, which was a busy year coincidentally. That was the Neon release, I believe. So that's just kind of to provide context.
One important thing here is don't think of it only as triaging and looking at old bugs for the sake of cleaning your backlog. There were many bugs that were reported 7-8 years ago, and it was not possible to fix them back then, but nowadays it was a matter of a couple of lines to achieve it. And we fixed many issues that people were facing, but they just gave up reporting by just looking at the bugzilla query and identifying these easy fixes nowadays. This was a big change, and we had some really surprised people seeing their bug fixed 8 years after they reported it. It doesn't sound right that anyone looks at so old bugs, but the technology improves constantly, and many of these issues are really easy to fix now.
Because of better debuggers.
Sorry?
Because of better facilities in the debug.
Yeah, better facilities in the operating systems, improving their toolkits, JVM changes, all the possible cases.
Word also travels fast, so if you close a ticket or you fix a ticket that was filed 8 years ago and that person is still reading their email, maybe they will say to their friends, oh, I filed a ticket 8 years ago and they finally got back to me. Maybe there is something going on there now. One would hope, one would hope. So I mostly covered all of this already. It's just about keeping a clean bugzilla, and the tickets that you are dealing with that are still reproducible, even if they were filed like 12 years ago, we still have some bugs that are reproducible from that long. It gives you a better picture of where you need to focus your efforts in the long run.
One interesting thing is that the amount of new bugs we see lately is lower than before cleaning bugzilla. I am not sure whether it's due to these small things that were repeated over and over, or it was people finding duplicates already reported easier and just adding them on CC, but the rate of new bugs coming reduced.
Actually, there's also something I forgot to mention. Yes, so we started using keywords to group bugs together. The keyword that I use and that one of my colleagues was pushing for and we started using is the triaged keyword. And that basically helps us sort through tickets that we've already touched. So for example, if there's a bug where I know it's reproducible or I've asked the user for information and they've confirmed it, and I know it's a valid bug, I will add the triaged keyword, and that way I can exclude it from my other searches and I know that it's something that I shouldn't close. And it gets put on my to-do list, and then depending on the priority, I will eventually get to it. Or I might get to it sooner. It really depends on what the issue is. And then we have just your general tips like not insulting people, being prompt in your responses as a respect for each other's time. Maybe a little bit of light humor to kind of ease the tension. We get some people in Bugzilla who are really upset that something isn't working, and if you respond to them in a friendly manner, or you just kind of turn the other cheek and don't take it personally, it really diffuses a lot of tension.
Yeah, and I know that at least I can't take it always calmly. So sometimes just saying, okay, please try to rephrase before I look at your bug even is better than simply ignoring the guy.
Or just completely ignoring any personal comments and dealing just with the technical aspects. Mailing list is kind of a quick topic because in SWT we don't really have that active a mailing list in the sense that we don't review patches over mailing lists, and there isn't that much traffic. But yeah. I will go over it anyways just because it's a general useful concept.
So the main thing about mailing list in SWT is I want to see it revived. I know that people use SWT in ways I cannot imagine. They have their use cases. Maybe they consider it not being a bug or a feature that may never appear, and that it's quite possible that this is the case, but at least raise it on the mailing list so we, the maintainers, are aware of the needs and what's missing in a discussion which we will end up with some resolution, either to come up with a bug where we can track the actual work if it's possible, or just say we cannot achieve it for some reason. But having the conversation between the contributors and the users on some central place, it's really helpful. We are not seeing much content on the mailing list, which is a big minus for the project. So raise the news that we want people to just voice their opinion and state what they need.
Yep. So some general tips if you are a committer of a project and you have mailing lists. One of them would be avoid getting into super detailed technical discussions on mailing lists because it can spin out of control quickly. If users have an issue or something that's really concrete, best thing to do is put it in Bugzilla, and that way you have a central place to deal with all the technical stuff. Another thing is if you have too many mailing lists, like that's a little bit confusing sometimes for someone who's new and they want to ask a question and then they look and there's like 5 different mailing lists that all vary just by some slight detail. It's just too much. So keep those down to a minimum. Okay, now the fun. Patch reviews and Garrett. So like with Bugzilla tickets, if someone has uploaded a Garrett patch, don't let it sit forever. If someone took the time to write some code, no matter what it is for your project, it would be rude just to ignore it for weeks on end and then kind of get to it when you feel like it. Even if you don't have time to review something right away, it's just a good policy to write a comment and say, oh yeah, I'm really busy this week, I can't review it, I'll take a look next week, or push it to another committer for them to review. At least some sort of feedback to the submitter so that they know that their patch has been looked at or that we're aware of it and we'll do something about it.
there is a kind of feedback that is worse than no feedback. And this is saying, sorry, I'm not reviewing that, it's not on my agenda, I don't have time for your stuff, and such things. If you do that, you are practically trying to kill the community around the project. Because this is the effect. You say it to 1, 2, 3 persons, they will spread it to 100 times more, and you reduce your chances of potential new contributors to almost zero. Only people that eventually get paid to work on that, and they will do it most likely unwillingly to do this, to work with you because of your behavior they have seen previously on the project. So even if you can't find the time, trying to be open and say, okay, give me some test case that validates 90% of the code review. It's not something that people will most likely do, but at least it's something measurable that is not telling the person, I don't care about your stuff. We are seeing this in a number of projects, and it's, at least for me, it reduces my will to even deal with these projects to zero. So it's really, really important to never try to discourage person to contribute.
Yep. Another thing too, actually just off the top of my head is, even if you don't have time to review a patch in depth, but you see right off the bat there's something wrong with the patch, that is a quick, you don't even have to look at it in depth, you can tell right away. The number one issue I would say in this case is copyright headers missing. People uploading a snippet to go with their patch and there's no copyright headers, or they haven't done something. I will say right away, I will review your patch in depth later this week, but in the meantime, can you please do X, Y, Z? And at least that way they have something to do in the meantime, and then it speeds up the process later on. So in terms of actually reviewing the patch, some good advice would be not to be overly harsh right on the outset, especially if it's someone who's contributing for the first time. So if you're contributing a patch somewhere and a committer comes out of the blue and starts really ripping you a new one about X, Y, Z, or some things you didn't even know, you're probably going to feel pretty discouraged and you're not going to come back. So be polite is the first one. Not everyone is always aware of what goes on in your project, but still keep firm code standards. And a big thing about code standards is they should be documented somewhere so that people who are contributing can look at some sort of document and say, okay, this is what I have to do, this is the procedure and the policies, and they can follow them. There's nothing more frustrating than having your work rejected due to something that you didn't know, which might to you seem completely arbitrary. Very frustrating.
Yeah.
And we will talk about documentation in a second, but
just something more about this part. Eric mentioned code style and so on. It's really good to stick to something that's default. In Eclipse, you have Eclipse formatter as a default, or the Java formatter, the conventional one. So stick to them. Just moving comma on the next one or on the previous one, it generates nothing but confusion in everyone, and it makes it harder for people to contribute to the project. Another thing about reviewing, it's it should be going with bigger and bigger expectations based on the amount of patches that the person contributed already. If it's someone you are looking to grow up into a committer because he contributed 10 patches already, or 3, but very important one, it's fine to communicate with the person and tell, okay, I'm looking to make you a committer. As such, I expect you to have X, Y, Z skills which you're not showing. While for a first-time contributor, many times the patch is not correct. I will state it, I will say it, I will merge the patch and push a second commit fixing the issue myself. That's a way to show that we value that you identified the problem, you partially fixed it, we give you the credit for that, and we're finishing our part. Of course, for a fellow committer, I'm not doing that. I'll just point it directly and please fix your stuff. So expectations depend on the amount of involvement of the person in the project.
And then there's, after accepting a patch, thank you is always nice. I mean, in theory, someone could have done this in their free time, and not everyone works for a company that lets them work on their open source project of choice. So small encouragements like that is just a professional and friendly thing to do. The other thing too is if you see someone who has a pattern of submitting high quality code and they are being consistent in that, you should offer them with a committership, or at least approach them with the idea of a committership, because then they know that you're aware of their contributions and you're thinking about further steps. Anything else? No?
No.
No.
I forget to say thank you. Sorry if I did it to someone. Just when you look at 15 patches in an hour, you just forget where you wrote it and where not. So nothing personal, it happens.
So now we reach the topic of documentation, which is something that no one really likes to do and varies greatly from project to project. Some projects just use README files or HTML in their main directory. Some people have wikis. Some people have actual proper articles, like almost like a book. It varies greatly, but the one thing that SWT has and the Eclipse Foundation in general has is a wiki, which covers all sorts of projects. And I've taken it upon myself to improve the wiki because it was severely out of date and had information on there that was no longer relevant. For example, when I started editing it this summer, I noticed that there was a link to the 3.8 SWT release, the newest release. And I was like, okay, this kind of looks badly, you know, it's quite a while ago, maybe we should update this. So, about the wiki, it's basically just keep it organized, keep the articles up to date, keep it concise, have it in a central place so that people can access it. That's really all it takes, and just maintain it once in a while so that it doesn't get stale.
And we have hard time finding time to do that, so we are looking for contribution. It's a matter of usually taking a screenshot and updating it with the latest version, but it's something we don't manage to do. So it's an area everyone can help with.
Hold on. Okay. The other thing about Wiki too, really quickly, that I forgot about is it's very good to have a beginner's guide that you can point people to in the event that someone wanders into Bugzilla and says, oh, I have this issue, I would like to fix it, or I'd like to contribute an enhancement. How do I get started? Instead of typing out the same Bugzilla comment for every time you encounter this case, just point them to a beginner's guide that shows them the basics, like setting up eGit and your Garrett, setting up SWT tools, and the committing guidelines for writing a patch, and then that gives them something to do in the meantime, and you can deal with the rest later. So that's another important one. And then code documentation is also important as well. Not writing super long Java docs for everything so that it clogs up the content assist views. Referencing bug numbers when you write a commit message, and writing descriptive commit messages. These things might seem common sense to you if you're a developer, but to new people it might not necessarily come at the first time. And this is where Alex will talk more about some of the technical stuff.
Yeah, so it's as every project, there are limitations you have to play within, and one of the major concerns is when you design, when you take a long-term decision for your project, it's not only the technical part. You have to think about which one is likely to be a problem for contributors. For example, stating that we will still keep Java 5 as a minimum level, and insisting that each of the contributors find a Java 5 JVM on which they test, it's not realistic anymore. So we either say, okay, we can no longer support that level because we will limit our potential contributors, or you just limit the pool of contributors. And one such case was when we decided whether we go GTK 3 or GTK 2. We forced the move to GTK 3. We forced it a bit. But the reason for that was because the community doesn't speak, it's not only the contributors, users, committers, it's also the downstreams for you, the upstreams for the project itself. For us, on the Linux side, it was the GTK guys. At the time they stopped supporting GTK 2, all our issues were no longer possible to fix. And the way forward was to move. Even if we forced the move, we had practically no choice, as it would, if we insisted on stay on GTK 2, it would have cut us from other parts of the community, which is providing us the native toolkit. We faced a similar thing with a potential new contributor on Windows side. His first patch was removing Windows XP support. I don't know whether anyone cared about it, but he's seen it as a level 0 before he started doing his new job, his new work, because otherwise he would have to put a few hundred ifs inside the code. And in these cases, prioritizing it, the priority is the contributor. It's not the project, it's not the users in terms of freeloaders. People that only use it but never contribute back, they're less valuable than people that give something back. This doesn't align with companies' point of view, as companies see users as customers. But if you want to grow your project in terms of people working on it and influence, your path is to care more about the contributor than caring about few potential users on XP, for example.
Unless you have a committer who is willing to work on Windows XP corner case bugs, which I highly doubt. Alex, you kind of already spoke about this.
I think I covered that part.
I think you covered the next 5 slides. This one is important.
Yeah, so when I started, it was almost impossible to build SWT yourself. Building it, it was not run anywhere. It was not hooked into our Gerrit system, so you had to wait for the nightly build. And even in this case, parts of the build were happening on other machines that were elsewhere, to which we didn't have access to the regular committers. So I had other committers sending me the error walk and best guessing what actually happened. This was really hard to start contributing to the project. If I wasn't paid at that time to do that work, I would probably have given up on the second month. And one of the nowadays we are at a state where all changes are validated, even to the native compilation. Tests are runnable inside the IDE and from the Maven build system. We have updated the test suite from JUnit 2.3 to JUnit 4, and this update ended up reducing the number of test cases we have. I think it was more than 1,000 test cases less, but this was just fake number due to the way things were running on the newer JUnit runtimes by using the old JUnit API. It was actual bugs giving us the false feeling of security, while in reality we were just not testing that much. Regarding automated tests, it's something to be taken really seriously, especially on projects that deal with stuff from other ecosystems. do we have to stop now or?
No,
Okay.
come to an end.
So the thing is, in this case, we ended up testing in a way which is almost impossible because you run on a certain GTK version or certain Windows version, but this ends up not being the case which your user will see. So the tests shouldn't be only runnable on your build machine or your development machine. It should be extremely easy for your user to run them and give you the feedback. And the feedback they give should be really, really making sense so you can get something valuable from the output. Yeah, so here we can summarize it. No matter how cool some technology tool would be, it doesn't matter if it's not well known. It might be possible to make a perfect build system which runs in 1/10 of the time we spent now with Maven, but no one will know how to run it. With Maven, most of the Java developers end up knowing it, so they have something they know how to run, how to inspect. So stick to what people know. This is the summary for this one.
And what's easy to find, like ancient X testing libraries that you have to install and hunt around for just to get the tests to run. I think we covered this mostly.
Yeah, what's most important here is this part.
Yeah.
So we have a very fancy way of dealing with 32-bit versus 64-bit in SWT tools. Which is in SWT, it is the kind of tool which no one else uses. And when I started, the only possible way to use it was to build it yourself. So you fetch the repository, you build it, you install it, and just after that part, you start doing actual SWT development. It went through multiple iterations. Now it's just a part of the regular update site, so people can install it. But still, it's something most people are not seeing by default, and they don't need it. So we still face cases where someone didn't install it. That's a perfect example of using a tool which is not well known, and you face issues with contributors just because of that. It's inevitable sometimes, but try to minimize it.
Okay, and I guess the last one, because we're running out of time, is we have some results of this sort of effort, in the sense that when I started working as an intern 3 years ago, we had no new contributors, and now we have had 4 in the last 16 months, really. One of whom is actually here, at the back. Just realized I misspelled your name, my apologies. It's Rolf, not Rold. But Rolf contributed GTK3 support on Windows, and it kind of came out of the blue in the sense that one day I came to work and there was like 20 Garrett patches from this guy named Rolf, and he added support for GTK on Windows. Okay, sure, I'll take it. And that's about it. Alex spoke about the Nikita thing with Windows XP removal. So that's it. Any questions? Yeah?
I have just a note. Thank you for your presentation. I totally agree with everything you said. In my company, we have an issue. We have difficulty in welcoming code contributions. Why? Because as a software provider, we are committed to the maintenance of the masters, of the software itself, and we have a service level agreement. So we are committed about the demanding validation process. So we have to check very carefully the code contributions. And I have to admit that we are bad doing that because it takes time. And even if I totally agree with everything you said, in the real life it's sometimes difficult, unfortunately.
I've faced that in a number of projects, and my opinion is companies should first decide whether they want this to be a company-driven project or a real open source one. That's the first decision to be made by the company and the community after that. Because trying to be in both worlds, it really doesn't work well.
That's very well said.
It's really common this day for companies to open source projects. Most of the time for being able to claim being open source and take all the buzz from that. But in reality, until you get some community behind it, I would not call it an open source project. And Apache Foundation has a really, really nice way of measuring that. In order to create a project and stay there, you need at least 3 different companies to have committers before it's considered as a real project. And it's a metric that can be easily faulted, but it speaks a lot about company-driven projects. They are usually not welcoming users, and when they end up wondering why this is happening, it's because the agenda of the developers, it's not known by the potential contributors, and when they mismatch, it's not that easy to get people back. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.